Our next talk is also by Matthew and Ondrea Hummel, Tamarisk leaf beetle species and habitat analysis with management implications for the Middle Rio Grande, New Mexico. And before she starts, I just want to really thank again West and also this beautiful facility for hosting us. It's just been really wonderful, and thank you very much. So Ondrea.
All right, thanks for staying for the last talk of the day. One more, Tamarisk leaf beetle, salt cedar, we're ready, right? Stay with me. Okay, great, thank you. Just to tag on a little more to Matt's talk, we're going to talk a little more detail about a study that we've been working on together. And I also have with us Chris Anderson from Tetra Tech, who's also on the project. And also, I'll give you a fair warning, I'm going to have to jet shortly after we're done. So if you have questions, ask them. So as Matt gave an overview, we started getting Tamarisk leaf beetle in Middle Grande 2011. Collaborative program through Corps of Engineers funding has been supportive of annual monitoring that Matt's been doing up and down the river in coordination with them to make sure we have coverage to track the species as well as the convergence of 3 species as Matt just showed. So because of that, we were looking at those 3 species and exactly where they might converge in Socorro County is where it was looking like and has occurred. And so prior to that in 2016, we chose this study location because of that, and working with Socorro County and Save Our Bosque Task Force. They were already doing fuel reduction efforts. They've had a number of fires in the area over the past 10 to 15 years. So we targeted areas that they were looking at for fuel reduction. That hasn't occurred yet, but we are still able to perform the study and do a number of things at these sites. So we have both control sites and study sites. And the main objective was to determine the effects of bird habitat structure and vegetation community response on Tamarisk and dominated sites affected by Tamarisk leaf beetle. So we evaluated the pre-treatment conditions. We also looked at the TLB affected sites over time using remote sensing and evaluated the monitoring criteria that I'm going to talk about. One of the other pieces that we performed, make sure we had data on both flycatcher and cuckoo in the study area. Bureau Reclamation, as Dave talked about earlier today, covers the majority of that area. There were some areas outside of the levee in the study area that we also performed surveys on. As you can see in 17 and 18, migrating flycatcher stopover was used in the area but did not nest, but lots of cuckoo use for stopover, for foraging, and established territories. And that was the case for the areas to the east of the levee as well. And we looked at the remote sensing of the area to also tie back to avian use, which Matt's going to talk about in a little more detail. But especially since for flycatcher and cuckoo, we use that information to develop the habitat suitability models and Hinkenoma vegetation that we're all using for our projects. So for the remote sensing, we looked at the study area, but a little bit broader area within that in the 2016 to 2018 timeframe for our study. Overall, Tamarisk stands decreased about 6%, native stands increased about 3%. But what I want to show you is here's a snapshot where you can see just a little more detail on that breakdown. So the red is where salt cedar declined, yellow is where it stayed the same, green is where it increased. And if you look at the percentages in the box here, it stayed the same in about half of the study area. So 50% of salt cedars stayed the same. About 26% declined, attributed to Tamarisk leaf beetle in the area, and about 21% increased. And I'll also point out, so of course where we had a decline, we had a flycatcher nest, and so that's sort of the overarching impact that we're talking about, especially related to flycatcher or Tamarisk leaf beetle in the system. So we've used the remote sensing for this analysis. We've also used it on other projects like Tiffany was mentioned earlier today to look at burn severity, and then you can also overlay all those pieces in combination with the groundwork to get a better picture of what's going on. So we did also do some field analysis on the ground. Those plots I mentioned, we had 30 sites that we broke up using the Hinkenoma 2016 information to target Tamarisk dominated sites, Russian olive dominated sites, and then mixed stands to make sure we had 10 of each type of sites so we could look at the different effects. And not able to go into a ton of detail, so I can give Matt some time to talk about Tamarisk leaf beetle and the avian work. But one of the main things we wanted to point out is that you can see the understory in the Tamarisk is much greater than in the mixed or native stands, and that can definitely play into the fire behavior, which we had a lot, especially in Coral County over the past years. And the stand types, the vegetation types are also tied to that Tamarisk leaf beetle use and avian use, which Matt is going to talk about.
So we've already talked about this. This was, just to introduce the beetle again and how we're going to play, how this was going to look at, because we're going to look at biocontrol and removal of Tamarisk and Russian olive and how it affects birds. And again, just as far as biocontrol. And so the thing is, how are birds responding to biocontrol? How are birds responding to the different degrees of defoliation? And how is it responding to beyond defoliation and this branch die-off? So we wanted to look at those two aspects as far as biocontrol. And we're looking at all birds. So I was psyched about this project because we're finally getting beyond the willow flycatcher. And then mechanical control, how are these birds going to respond? Of course, it's going to be a negative response initially to this type of control. And then you have the kochia that comes in. How are birds responding to that? But then finally, you have a positive thing where there's a native that comes in and the birds respond in a positive aspect to that type of proper control and restoration. So why do we care? Well, 50% of the land birds that breed in the U.S. Southwest are directly dependent on riparian habitats. Invasion of this non-native species into the ecosystem is the second greatest ecological threat worldwide. And Tamarisk and Russian olive and other invasive plants in the Southwest United States are identified as threats to migratory bird populations on nearly all federal, state, and local conservation management plans. So our objective was to look at bird habitat relationships with particular focus on the bird's response to Tamarisk beetle biocontrol at sites that are dominated by Tamarisk and sites with Tamarisk component that are otherwise dominated by native vegetation. And then how birds respond to Tamarisk and Russian olive removal. Treatment sites prior to the treatment and then after the treatment, and treatment sites would be compared to the control sites. And we used point counts and we visited each site at least 2. We really focused it on the breeding birds. We didn't want to look at migrants or stopover. We really focused in the time frame that they were breeding. So that was why we limited a number of times that we actually were out there. We calculated the bird species richness at each site by summing the number of species detected within each site. And then we modeled overall species-specific bird densities using distance. And then we really wanted to look at structure. What structure is the birds actually using? From the dense Tamarisk and Russian olive all the way up to the cottonwood. So at each point we quantified and estimated the vegetation structure. And then this vegetation characteristics and of the study sites were summarized using 2 principal component analysis. And so what we really found that these, it was this cottonwood overstory or this Russian olive Tamarisk understory that the birds were really using in the sites that we were looking at. And there was this gradient that they were using within that structure. And what we found that the species richness really didn't change as far as the understory, the cottonwood understory, or the Tamarisk overstory. But we did see density of the birds in higher in the Russian olive and the overstory, the Tamarisk Russian olive understory compared to the cottonwood overstory. And the 2 birds that really popped out as far as that were significant, and this is all based on 1 year. We were, hoping that this would be a long-term study, but we only got 1 year's worth of funding. But we found that the Buick's wrens and the summer tanagers were significant in what areas they were really occupying. And you can see that on the far side of this x-axis is where Russian olive, Tamarisk understory, and as you go along the x-axis, that increases as the cottonwood is greater than 9 meters. And this is the density of birds. And you can see that the Buick's wrens really occupy that Russian olive understory. Russian-Olive Tamarisk understory, and they decline as you go up into the canopy. But the summer tanagers were really increased in that overstory. That's what they really relied on. You can see that the Bell's Vireo really occupy mesquite, so they didn't really occupy these components. But the black-headed grosbeak kind of occupy it all. And so again, this whole structure thing is what really is, I think, important. And that's why, you know, when we're thinking about restoration, this tamarisk shrub valuable with mixed native is pretty important. So to reduce the density of tamarisk at 60 to 70% is, I think, you know, what we're seeing is ideal. And then prioritize eliminating the tamarisk trees and leaving the tamarisk shrubs, and then start planting. You know, start planting that willow and cottonwood. And then as far as the total vegetation, as far as Russian olive, Fisher et al. In 2012 in Idaho found that vegetation cover is more important than the composition. So that Russian olive really provides that. But if you exceed that cover between 60 and 70%, then it's negative toward the birds. But we really are just like, we really don't know a lot about removal of Russian olive and how it impacts the avian community.
Just one last slide on closing recommendations. As Matt mentioned, some of the annual TLB monitoring as well as this study is not being funded for next year. So just in terms of still tracking where we have tamarisk leaf beetle and potential effects to flycatcher, we feel that's a very critical component to try to continue next year. The avian surveys that go along with that to determine where the birds are moving, what habitat they're using, and then the habitat type by looking at the vegetation. And some of this can be done also using remote sensing, but we feel that, you know, the on-the-ground information is also very important. That's where we've been using, you know, remote sensing, can look at sentinel every 16 days even to look at tamarisk leaf beetle more closely if you're trying to target areas. And then looking at the monitoring efforts related to habitat, both in the short term and the long term. And I think that's it. Thanks for all that.
Do you have time for questions?
Yes.
Okay. Questions for any of you? Okay, we're leaf beetle down. So,
You know where to find us.
All right, thanks everybody for sticking with us. So a few closing remarks. I promise to be very, very brief. First, thanks to Boston Center for hosting us. It's a beautiful space. They've been fantastic to us. I want to thank the city attorney representatives, Beetle, like went out campaign yesterday. Whether they volunteer or voluntold by me, thank you. I want to thank the moderators, Lynette, Ashley, Bo, Vicki, and Grace. Thanks for stepping up. And the Boston Walk leaders, Bill Hendler, John Hayes, Amy Erickson, and Chuck Hayes. Thank you all. We've had a great time on this Boston Walk with you. We're able to join them. This was meant to be a forum to share information, and I think it certainly did that. I want to thank the presenters for sharing the great work that they've been doing. I want to also thank you guys, the audience, for asking great questions and starting a great conversation and discussion. I want to reiterate, this conversation should not end today. This is an iterative process, it's as part of that management. So I encourage all of you to continue having these conversations, talk to each other, between researchers, agencies, organizations, between managers and scientists, so that we continue using the best science for the best mission decisions for not just the species, but for the river ecosystem as a whole. With that, thank you.